Pnawn da, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name's Stefan Evans, and I head up the Bevan Foundation's work on poverty. I'm delighted that so many of you have been able to join us this afternoon as we launch this new work. Alongside me here this afternoon is my colleague Caroline Richards from the Bevan Foundation. Many of you will have been having emails, etc., from Caroline, I'm sure. Um, I have had some tech issues myself recently with Zoom, so if I vanish, Caroline is here to hold the fort. So hopefully it will all go swimmingly, but Caroline is here for that. And Zoe and Isabel are here from Policy and Practice, and I let them introduce themselves when I hand over to them, and they'll be talking about the work. Just quickly before I hand over to them, some housekeeping and just some broader context, I guess, for where this webinar comes in this afternoon. So for those of you who might not be familiar with us, the Bevan Foundation is Wales's most influential think tank, and we work to find long-term solutions to poverty and inequality. And over the last 20 years, I think there's a frustration that there's been no real progress in reducing the number of people living in poverty in Wales. And with just a year to go until the election, there's been a desire from a lot of people in Wales to better understand what could we be doing differently as we look ahead to that election to really start making some progress. So we're pleased that we were able to coordinate some funding between ourselves, Wales TUC, the Welsh Local Government Association and Community Housing Cymru, to work with policy and practice and two Welsh local authorities to go out and model and get a sense of what might work more effectively to be able to make a difference to poverty in Wales. And I'll let Zoe touch on the findings of that work and explain a bit more about the methodology and what we did in a second. With that said, I will hand over to Zoe to talk through the findings, which is what I'm sure all of you are really interested in hearing about this lunchtime. So thanks, Zoe.
Thanks very much, Stefan. I'm Zoe Charlesworth from Policy and Practice, and I'm here today with my colleague Isabel, who's our lead data analyst for this bit of work we've undertaken for the Bevan Foundation and their partners. Any questions at the end? If you've got some really in-depth data analytical questions, I'll be handing this straight over to Isabel, so you'll meet her then. So this webinar is entitled "What Works to End Poverty in Wales." That's a pretty wide title and a very difficult question to answer. If we can go to the next slide, please, Caroline. So what I'm hoping to cover is the backgrounds and the objectives to the research we've undertaken, the policy interventions we decided to focus on, the findings, some considerations around implementation and moving forward, and some recommendations. I'd like to state at this point that the recommendations come from policy and practice. They come from the data, what we saw in the data. They don't necessarily represent the view or opinions of the Bevan Foundation and the funding partners. Thanks, Caroline. Little bit of background. I won't go over this. I'm sure most people on this call will be aware of the background. But poverty does remain persistent in Wales. It's slightly higher than the UK, not much, but child poverty is higher and persistent poverty is higher. So there is an issue. And as Stefan says, this has stayed the same for a long while. The welfare system doesn't offer the safety net that we would hope it would do, in that about half of people on welfare benefits are in poverty. And actually, the only real protection within welfare benefits to poverty is LCWRA, limited capability for work, and PIP. We see much lower poverty levels amongst people who receive those. I'm talking about poverty, we're just measuring income here. So, I know there's more costs. But with changes in disability benefits, we might even see increases in poverty. Recent initiatives in Wales have been, you've had a major take-up campaign around benefits. You're moving forward with the Welsh benefit system. So there's a lot of movement in Wales around poverty, and the Welsh Government has reiterated its commitment to end poverty, particularly child poverty, with its child poverty strategy. And we've seen some interesting work in another devolved nation, Scotland, with their child support payment. So there's interesting work going on, but as Stefan says, little has changed. So thanks, Caroline. Next slide. So the objectives of this research was to look at what could make a change, what policy interventions could make a difference to poverty rates in Wales. That's the research report there on the right. And that can be downloaded from the website or from Bevan website and from the Policy and Practice website. And I'm sure Stefan will go into that afterwards. Thanks, Caroline. So how are we going to do this research? We had benefits data from 2 Welsh authorities, and we'd like to thank them very much for participating and steering us in this. Now, this data holds information on some of the poorest households in Wales. So it's households who are receiving means-tested benefit and council tax reduction. So within this data, we can see details of household circumstances, household size, and all the income types and savings. The data we had represented 10% of households on means-tested benefits and council tax reduction. So it's a pretty good data sample and pretty representative. We put this data through our modelling engine to find baseline rates of poverty. We then make policy changes and compare the poverty results after those changes, which allows us to actually see the impact on poverty in Wales of various policy interventions. Thanks, Caroline. The key metric we were looking at is relative poverty. We were looking at before housing costs. And this is, most people know, relative poverty is measured as income, which is 60% below the median income. It's the most common poverty measure we see in research, and it's used by governments, public sector, all sorts of bodies who are involved with anti-poverty initiatives. And because of that, it has political resonance. Everyone's talking about poverty rate going up or down. So it's quite an important metric. But the group of households we're looking at, we are concentrating this research on the 20% poorest households in Wales. Now, some of these households are in really deep poverty. I think the average depth of poverty, I've got it there on the slide, the average depth of poverty is £470. So they're £470 below the poverty line. So any small change is not going to move them out of poverty, and we'll see no change to the number of households in relative poverty. Because of that, depth of poverty, measuring the impact on depth of poverty is more important, because you would need a very large change to move some of these households out of poverty. Thanks, Caroline. Because of that, we're measuring 4 things for each of the policy interventions. We're looking at how many people it affects. You could have a very effective anti-poverty initiative, but only affecting a few households. It's not going to be very helpful. We're measuring depth of poverty, change in relative poverty, although, as I said, most policy changes will not bring people above the poverty line. It's worth measuring just so that we have an idea if it does have an impact on the proportion of the Welsh population in poverty. And the Welsh Government is focused particularly on child poverty, given the persistence of child poverty in Wales. So we're looking at changes in child poverty as well. Within the report, we have a few measures of child poverty for larger families, those with children under 4, but I'm just looking at, for this presentation, I'm just covering the proportion of children who live in households that are in poverty. Thanks, Caroline. So these are the models that we decided to focus on. These were chosen because of their currency, because they're being discussed at the moment, or because of their feasibility and practicality. And they were all designed by the steering group, to which we're very grateful in this research. First of all, we looked at what would happen if employment was to increase for job seekers, so people without barriers to work who are able to work. And this is a very low proportion within the poorest 20% of households. The proportion of people who don't have barriers to work is particularly low, because the majority of people who are means-tested benefits have barriers to work, such as caring responsibilities, illness, disability. But so we moved that first model, we moved 50% of people who were able to work into work. That model basically represents a shorter unemployment period for job seekers. Although saying that, the period of unemployment for job seekers hasn't increased at all. It's always stayed very steady, with, I think it's nearly 90% of people get jobs within a year. But if that could be reduced down, it could have an impact on poverty. The second model is looking at if there was some support for parents with children under 13 to move into part-time work. We've modelled part-time work there because that fits with the DWP expectations of parents of a child under 13. Model 3, removing housing support restrictions. So that's LHA reductions to benefit and benefit cap, bedroom tax reductions. Model 4 is looking at a Welsh child payment, similar to the Scottish child payment. It was the easiest model to base this on, was to sort of replicate what's been done in Scotland. Model 5, ending the 2-child limit, and Model 6, increasing the minimum wage. So I'm going to just go through some findings from these. There's an awful lot of data in the report. I'm going to try and compact that down. So if you have any more in-depth questions about any of the findings, do ask them. Firstly, moving people to employment, which is the first 2 sections here, Model 1 and Model 2. This had a very powerful impact on moving people out of poverty. There is no doubt that employment, moving to work, can move people out of poverty. Moving to full-time work, nearly 90% of people moved out of poverty if they went to full-time work. And for those who remained in poverty, the depth of poverty reduced significantly. The disadvantage of this is that there's relatively few households amongst the lowest quintile who don't have barriers to work, who are actually in between jobs, looking for work, job seekers. So although it's very powerful for people to move to work quicker, there aren't that many who can do so. And because of this, there's minimal impact on child poverty. Moving parents with children under 13 to part-time work actually did have a noticeable impact on child poverty. All these people are parents, so one would imagine it would do. But there was a 11% reduction in child poverty. And half of those who moved into part-time work moved out of poverty. It's interesting that move to part-time work doesn't actually move everybody out of poverty. But for those who remain in poverty after a move to part-time work, the depth of poverty reduced significantly again. But the downside of this, again, is similar to moving to full-time work. There were only very small proportion of the population who had a child under 13 with no other barriers to work. So there was little impact on the overall proportion of households in relative poverty. Removing housing support restrictions, the LHA and bedroom tax. To model this, what we did was imagine that the housing element was equal to the full rent. Unlike the first 2 models, this had a very wide-ranging impact. Nearly a third of households were affected. And there's going to be impacts outside what we can see in the data around homelessness, risk of homelessness. I think that some previous research that PIP did showed that out of every 1,000 households that have a housing element restricted, 44 will move to temporary accommodation across the UK. So there are implications here beyond the impacts we can see in the data in terms of poverty. The disadvantage of removing housing support restrictions is the interaction with the benefit cap. So the full realization of the extra income will not affect men. Not all houses will see that. And there's little impact on the overall proportion of households in relative poverty or on children in poverty. The reason for this is because removing the household support restrictions, although really important to households in terms of making housing affordable, is actually quite low, the reduction. I think the average in Wales is about 150 a month housing support restrictions, which is quite low to remove compared to other interventions like removing the 2-child limit or having a child support payment. So although we see little impact on overall poverty, it does impact an awful lot of people. Thanks, Caroline. The introduction of a Welsh child payment had wide-ranging impacts. It affected a third of low-income households, similar to removing housing deductions. So it had one of the widest the highest breadth of impact. It actually had a significant impact on child poverty, as we'd expect. Child poverty reduced by a quarter, and children in larger households saw a noticeable reduction in poverty. It actually had such an impact that we also saw a measurable change in the proportion of households in relative poverty. And I think the downside of this is, although this isn't a data comment, this is outside the data comment, but it's a criticism that the Scottish Child Payment has received, in that in Scotland you receive it if you get universal credit, and it may act as an incentive for people to remain receiving means tested benefits. So I've put that in because that is a criticism of the Scottish one, but it's not shown in the data, obviously. The next model, ending the 2-child limit, very current at the moment, obviously has a significant reduction in child poverty, not as much as the Welsh Child Payment. The 2-child limit reduces child poverty by about 11%. But for the households that do, who are affected, there is a noticeable change in the depth of poverty. There are very few households with more than 2 children. It was only 3% of our sample. So this isn't a wide-ranging, this intervention wouldn't affect many households, but it does have a significant impact on those it does affect. And like the end of housing reductions, the interaction with the benefit cap will actually sort of dampen down any impact. And finally, the increase in the national minimum wage. For some households that work full-time, they moved out of poverty with that small bit of additional wages. We increased the national minimum wage to £15 per hour across all age groups. But amongst the poorest households, there are very few people in full-time work, because full-time work takes most people out of benefit system. So there are very few in full-time work, and the majority of people who are working, are modelled as receiving the additional money for an increase in the national minimum wage, are working part-time. So the total increase in income is not enough to have a major impact. I think we have to remember that this model is based on on benefit recipients. These are the poorest households in Wales. Obviously, increasing the national minimum wage would have a major impact across the whole of Welsh economy, and people who are in poverty but not represented in the benefits data set. But within the benefits data set, very few people are affected by this. So there's little impact on child poverty and little impact on the proportion of people in relative poverty. Thanks, Caroline. I think it's useful to look across the 4 metrics we talked about: the number of people affected, the change in depth of poverty, the proportion of people in relative poverty, and the impact on child poverty, and actually compare all these interventions, because then the strengths and weaknesses become much more apparent. If we look at a breadth of impact, i.e. how many people in poverty amongst the poorest 20% of households in Wales will this reach? 2 interventions affect a significant proportion, and that's removing housing deductions and having a Welsh Child Payment. Both of those reach nearly a third of your poorest households. So a third of your poorest households will be better off with those interventions. The impact on the depth of poverty, the employment interventions, if you look at the first 2 columns, which is move to full-time work for those people who are job seekers, or move to part-time work for parents with children under 13. Those have the biggest impacts on reducing depth of poverty. They come the closest to bringing people out of poverty, and both those interventions we saw that a high proportion move out of poverty altogether. But if we just flick back to the last one again, Caroline, if you can see, the ones with narrower impact often have the greater impact on the depth of poverty. So we can have a look at these all these ones with a wide base here, the removing housing support, adding the Welsh child payment, they don't have such a dramatic impact on the depth of poverty, but they reach more people. Thanks, Caroline. As I mentioned earlier, for these households, the starting baseline point was an average depth of poverty, i.e. the amount they were below the poverty line of £470. So you need a major intervention to move households out of poverty. We didn't expect with many of these interventions to see a major change in the households that you would count as being in relative poverty. So for all these 6 interventions, all these changes are below 5%. But even though the move to full-time work for job seekers affected a small proportion of the caseload, those it did affect most of them moved out of poverty. So that had the biggest impact. There is no doubt that if people can work, going to work has a major impact on poverty. But the Welsh child payment also had quite a significant impact on a proportion of households in relative poverty. We always have to remember that the vast majority of the poorest households have barriers to work, so employment initiatives may not be an option. So what out of the non-employment initiatives, targeted support towards children seems to be quite powerful. And child poverty, looking specifically at child poverty, because this is a particular focus of the Welsh Government, the Welsh child payment, as we would expect, has the most impact, moves nearly a quarter of children in poverty out of poverty. The 2-child limit obviously has an impact, but that's only affecting a relatively small number of households. Thanks. We made an attempt to give equal weighting to these 4 metrics and aggregate them into one with an equivalized score of 1 overall. So all these figures add up to 1. It's a mechanism by which can be used if you wish to give weighting to more, if you wish to reduce depth of poverty more, or you want to have a wider reach in a poverty initiative, any of those 4 metrics can be given greater weighting. But if they're given equal weighting, if we say we care as much about child poverty as we care about the people in relative poverty, the Welsh child payment comes out as the most powerful, very closely followed by employment initiatives. So what are the conclusion from all those findings? And there's a lot of data in the report. I mean, so a lot more than that in the report. And if you're interested in child poverty, there's a bigger breakdown of child poverty within the report. Obviously, no single policy measure can eliminate poverty, but targeted interventions can reduce impact and can reduce severity of poverty. Overall, the Welsh child payment looked like the most powerful intervention, affecting a third of households and actually reducing child poverty and relative poverty. But employment interventions are really the most powerful for bringing people out of poverty. And I think really there needs to be a dual approach to this, looking at income raising through benefits or grants at the same time as employment initiatives. Some considerations about introducing any anti-poverty measures is, first of all, the capacity of the Welsh Government is constrained because of the division of power between Westminster and the Senedd. The Welsh Government doesn't have power over the main means tested benefits. And actually things like a child support payment, the problems and the criticism that's been aimed at Scotland regarding incentive to stay on benefits, if it had the possibility of introducing it as an addition to the child element, that would overcome those issues. But that doesn't lie with the Welsh Government, that lies with Westminster. Saying that, the Welsh Government does have a lot of levers at its disposal. It has power over housing, local welfare assistance, discretionary support, early years provision, employment support, childcare, And all of those can be used to mitigate the impact of poverty. The other thing to take into consideration is the changing policy landscape. I mentioned earlier the planned UK government reforms to disability and sickness benefits. We did some additional work for Bevan on this, and that will be on their website as well. But we did see it disproportionately affected Wales, and there is the modelling we did show there was a risk that if these reforms were implemented in their current, how they are currently, we could see a significant rise in poverty in Wales and a 4% rise in child poverty in Wales. So any move to reduce child poverty now is probably getting quite urgent in order to sort of balance out possible changes happening in the future. There's also ongoing debate about the 2-child limit. The government isn't denying that they're going to, at some point, get rid of the 2-child limit, and they would be if that they've been sort of just pushing it back over and over again. But one imagines that at some point the 2-child limit will be removed. But this does cause, for the Welsh Government, if it wishes to support larger families, there's a bit of policy uncertainty there, and really, it's probably better to wait and see. I mean, I imagine the Welsh Government has much more insight into this. Thanks, Caroline. Out of the research, we came up with some recommendations. I mean, the Welsh child payment came out so powerful that we do suggest that the Welsh Government explores mechanisms to introduce something similar. I understand that the powers of the Welsh Government are different to the Scottish Government, and it's not clear at the moment whether they have the power to do this or not. But that's why we've just said explore mechanisms. It may be through a grant or something else, or through some sort of discretionary support. The Welsh Government has, in a way, been doing this anyway through the rollout of breakfast clubs and free school meals. Although it's not a financial support, with the breakfast and the free school meals together, they almost equal the equivalent of the Scottish child payment. But it's obviously limited to primary schools at the moment. Childcare access would have a big, if parents with children under 13 were more able to move to work, that would have actually an impact on poverty. And as we saw, that would reduce child poverty by nearly just over 10%, I believe. Moving to full-time employment, big impact. So we definitely would recommend further employment initiatives. We feel it'd be good if the Welsh Government could have some more power over benefit policies. I'm sure the Welsh Government does as well. But it really does tie the hands of the Welsh Government in making changes when it doesn't have complete control over the welfare system, because to move people out of poverty, you need quite dramatic impacts. Housing-related poverty, at the moment, the discretionary housing payment system it offsets that for only a small proportion. And actually, as we see, there's about a third of the people in poverty have housing reductions. So we would suggest that's extended and continued, and that it reaches most people who are in poverty with housing deductions. Disability reforms, another key recommendation is to prepare for disability reforms. I know a lot of councils are doing this already. They're supporting people with LCWRA to PIP, to make PIP applications before the reforms come in, just so they at least have a few years of transitional. But there may need to be some sort of support strategy around people who are ill but unable to move to work, because those people are unlikely to be in poverty at the moment. They're likely to be above the poverty line. They will fall below the poverty line. And finally, we recommend that the Welsh Government focus on a multidimensional poverty strategy. just looking at the proportion of the population in poverty doesn't help really extend to the poorest 20% of households, where they are so deep in poverty that anything to reduce the depth of poverty is going to be helpful, but you're unlikely to see any initiative actually affect the proportion of the overall population in relative poverty. Finally, we recommend that a dual strategy is taken forward. Using all the levers at the moment that the Welsh Government has around housing, childcare, employability support, but also pushing for change around the powers they have over benefits, over means-tested benefit system. I think I'll leave it there, Stefan. There's a lot more detail to go in the report, but I don't think we can cover much more in this session. So I'm happy to take any questions at all. And if there's any questions on the analysis, Isabel's here.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Yeah, I think that I hope others agree an incredibly interesting presentation. And as Zoe mentioned, the report can now be accessed in full. It's on Policy Practice's website, is on our website. And I know if you haven't received an email from Caroline already, you will receive an email from Caroline very shortly, those of you who've signed up for today to get access to the report in full. It's great to see that we've had questions come through already. So if you've got any, we've got some 10 minutes left to take questions if you've got any. And the first question we got through was a technical one, Zoe, but I think it's one that you can address, which is can you from David Willis asking about why did you look at poverty before housing costs rather than after housing costs through this modelling?
No, that is a technical question. The reason we did that is because the data isn't available for after housing costs. The only really reliable way to get after housing costs data is through field work and through surveys. We didn't really, in terms of analysis, it would have been very tricky to do any wider analysis using after housing costs.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. There's a couple of questions coming here from Ian Jones, so we'll take them in turn because I think both are interesting and will be of interest to others. So, obviously, the report itself does not contain separate results for the two local authorities, but he was asking, in doing your analysis, did you notice any differences in what worked better in the two areas, or was it quite similar what was coming through with regards to both?
Surprisingly, the data from the two councils was very similar. Within every category or cohort or different demographic, we would have seen no more difference than 2 or 3% of people in poverty. So they were surprisingly uniform. But then the two councils that we worked with were selected, and we asked to work with them merely because they had a very good demographic range across town and country and represented the demographics across Wales. So we're not really surprised they were so similar. But we saw very little difference between the two.
Yeah, that's really useful and interesting. Ian's asked as well, and maybe I should come to this last, but we'll go with it now. Around costings, so which provides the best impact per pound spent. So I don't know, Zoe, if you wanted to add anything on that.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at that as a separate sort of appendix to this. And costings are really difficult because what are you costing? I mean, you could basically do a whole three or 4 months additional report on that. Are you costing percentage change in depth of poverty? Is that what you're focusing on? Are you focusing on the cost per percentage of change in children in poverty? It's a really hard one to work out. And there are various initiatives that actually the cost of implementation is really hard. How do you cost employment support? How do you cost childcare facilities? But yes, costings need to be addressed, and it certainly needs more narrative on costings. We feel it's a really interesting area, and we're going to be putting a few figures in where there is an obvious sort of fiscal implication for the UK government if it was to get rid of the 2-child limit, if it was to reduce housing reductions. that it's not in there yet, but we wanted to keep this pretty theoretical. We were looking at what works. There was one focus of this bit of research, and it's what works, what has the widest impact. The cost is obviously a major consideration for the Welsh Government. And for the UK government, if they were to make any of these changes. But it's something to be addressed, I think, in depth elsewhere, perhaps in narrative within the report.
Thanks, Zoe. Yeah, and that's something to watch with space, perhaps, and we'll keep in touch with people as well. There's a question that we've had here about costs, actually, and about are you aware of any work that's been looking at costs and cost caps, access to free services, etc. I guess one of the challenges with any work like that is that because the poverty measure is a measure of income, a lot of those things don't seem to have an impact because it doesn't boost incomes directly in that way. But that question came in from Samuel Stensland, and he was asking, yeah, kind of, are you aware of perhaps work you've done or work that's going on elsewhere around costs and the relationship to what you've been talking about?
Yeah, I think it's. I actually think it's very important. We do a lot of analysis at Policy and Practice where we take off all housing costs that can be seen in data or through any other method, and we take a theoretical amount of cost per person for living. And actually, after costs, once you take into account costs, you can end up with slightly different results. I think it's particularly interesting given the rollout of free school meals in Wales and the breakfast clubs in Wales. And I'm not sure how Wales is going to respond to the universal credit extension from England that's coming up in 26-27. But you see those sort of, if you actually did a costing of those in terms of the cost for the free school meal, the cost of the breakfast club, you're getting close to the similar weekly cost to the Scottish Child Payment. So it's just looking at, I think not looking at costs is restricts the impact slightly. But once you start looking at costs, you're getting into a multi-year research program, and that is a problem we always have on everything around poverty and benefits, is that if you do an in-depth multi-year piece of work, by the time you've produced your results, the changes have happened.
Yeah.
So I think there's swings and roundabouts, isn't there? There are definitely advantages about doing this sort of analysis as fast as possible, get it out there, ready for the elections. But those long pieces of research, which the only way to take into account cost properly is through a larger piece of probably involving field work, which, as we know, always takes a long time.
Absolutely. And I should give a plug to a couple of separate pieces of work we've got ongoing around housing costs at the moment, in terms of, supply of social housing, for example, as another way of offsetting those costs. And I know that my colleague Joel has worked some work around the links between transport and poverty, which again, kind of the cost of transport as a barrier to accessing employment, kind of all of those pressures as well. So absolutely agree with what you were saying, Zoe. So I've seen we've had a few more questions in. So I'll take a couple of these, and then it's probably going to be time for us to close the session. I had a question, one in here from an anonymous attendee. So you mentioned about disability benefit reforms are likely to disproportionately affect people in Wales, and that person was inviting you to ask you a little bit more about what you meant by that.
Yeah, so Policy and Practice produced some analysis looking at the number of people, proportion of people on PIP, proportion of people on LCWA in every council in the country, and we found that many of the Welsh councils were very high up if they were put into order. There was a bigger impact, a higher proportion of, within many Welsh council areas, a higher proportion of people receiving disability and illness benefits than the rest of the country. Now, the freedom of information request that was provided recently by the government indicates about 40% of current claimants wouldn't receive those 4 points. So if we're looking into the future to these people not getting their PIP reassessment, we're looking at a financial loss, not just to the household, but to the local economy. And those are the figures we're taking into account when we're looking at, I think we were looking at a 10% rise in poverty, and a 4% rise in child poverty, but also some quite startling economic figures by region. And that analysis is available from Policy and Practice. If anybody wants to know what the impact's likely to be in their council, just let us know. But we did do a report on this for the Bevan Foundation. It'll be available on their website.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. And I think it also highlights, I guess, one of the things that kind of useful context, I guess, for the report as well is often what Welsh Government does is almost counterfactual. So the extra support for free school meals, had that not been there, would the impact of a two-child limit, for example, have been even greater in Wales if that support wasn't there for people? So sometimes, there is a challenge here. I appreciate for colleagues from Welsh Government who are on the calls who are doing good stuff, but if UK government policy, like those reforms, go completely the other way, it erodes the positive effect we would see, but they're still worth doing because things would be even worse if those actions.
I think that's really important, Stefan. I really do. I think that, we haven't taken that into account. We haven't said, following the disability reforms, this might be the case, and this would be the impact. Anything you can do to reduce poverty is going to be reducing poverty based on the policies you've got UK wide at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think time has got the better of us. Apologies, there's a few questions we haven't got to. I'm sure we'll be able to pick some of these up offline as well if people are interested. So if you want to drop us a line, more than happy to pass them on to Zoe, or if people want a conversation, I'm sure we'd be happy to see what we can do on that front as well. As we mentioned, the reports are now available online, so please make sure to go and check them out and explore them in more detail. But that's all that's left for me to do is thank all of you for attending and thank Zoe for her presentation and Isabel as well, who for all her work on the report as well. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you again soon, I'm sure.